My name is Chris Wright. I'm zoning counsel and partner at the Lasser Law Group. Today's podcast is important for anybody who owns property in the city of New York. I'm going to review the zoning regulations that govern the 5 boroughs and how they work to determine what you can do with your property. I'm going to review what uses you can use your property for, commercial or residential or a mix. I'm going to review the total square footage you can build on your property. Is it 50,000 square feet or 250,000 square feet? And I'm going to review how tall you can build your building. Are you capped at a brownstone, an apartment building, or a skyscraper? It's all very important for anybody who owns property in New York City. In addition, I'm going to discuss air rights transfers and the advantage to a buyer or a seller of an air rights transfer and how that process works. I'm going to go through a series of slides showing sections of the New York City zoning resolution, which I call the ZR. I will start with a map that shows all the regulations laid out on a street map. And then I go through the tables and charts that those regulations point to so you can determine these various factors about how to develop your property. Again, thank you for joining us. And now I will commence the slideshow. So this is a zoning map for the city of New York. The city is covered by approximately 100 of these maps. They're rectangulars to large checkerboard, and every property in the 5 boroughs appears on one of these maps. I've tried to pick a map that most people have some sense of. You can see the East River running down the middle. To the right is Williamsburg in Brooklyn. To the left is Thompson Square in the middle of the East Village. If you look on the upper left-hand corner where there's a large letters US, that's Union Square. In the lower left-hand corner of the map is LI, that's Little Italy. So that gives you a sense of where we are here. So what I'm going to focus on is the East Village. So if you look at the center of the East Village, Thompson Square, you can see lots of zoning regulations all around it. And the pattern I'm going to describe in the East Village is the same pattern that zoning uses to define residential neighborhoods. That is, neighborhoods that are residential in character, do not have hotels, do not have office buildings. They are designed to be residential. So the same pattern you'll find in the Upper East Side, in the Upper West Side. You'll find it in Park Slope and neighborhoods in Queens and neighborhoods in the Bronx that are residential. And so how does this work? So if you look at Thompson, focus on Thompson Square, you'll see there is a pattern that runs from right to left. You'll see a stripe of zoning districts that begin with an R. You'll see R8B, then on the avenue R7A, then R8B in the mid block, then on the avenue R7A, so forth from Avenue D to 3rd. And there's a reason for this. First, any zoning designation that begins with an R means residential. It means residential only. If you're in an R neighborhood, you cannot build a hotel. You cannot build an office building. You cannot build a large department store. You can only build residential. And then there's another concept. One of the prime goals of zoning is to allow light and air to get to the street. So the mid blocks tend to have narrow streets and the avenues tend to have higher streets. So the zoning for the mid block, in this case, the R8B, is lower density than the R7A that runs on the avenues. If you look closely, each R8B is within a rectangular box that only covers the middle of the block. The avenues are covered by an R7A, and the portions of each block that front on an avenue are within the R7A. And so now you look closer, you can see the R8A, R7A, R8B, R7A moving from north and south throughout the East Village. And the R7A is a higher density, allows for a bigger building with more square footage than the R8B. And as I said, you cannot have any commercial development of this type. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I've been to the East Village and I've walked down the side streets and I've seen lots of commercial stores in the ground floor. Well, there's a reason for that. The zoning resolution was enacted in 1961, and much of New York City was built prior to 61, particularly the East Village. So if you have a commercial use in the East Village, even though it's designated with an R residential only, it's called grandfathered. So uses in the East Village, commercial uses in the East Village, which is all those restaurants you see on the side streets, were all there pre-61. So they're grandfathered in. But if you built a new building in the East Village, you could not have ground floor retail. And I hope that makes sense. So because the 1961 date is very important, because if you're pre-61, you may be grandfathered. If you're post 61, then you have to comply with underlying zoning. And so that's the concept. I mean, if you look at Upper West Side neighborhoods, Upper East Side neighborhoods, Park Slope neighborhoods, you go to the mid-block, you see very little commercial activity, almost none, because those neighborhoods were built much more recently. But if they had a commercial use pre-61 on a side street in Park Slope, then it's grandfathered. So while the idea behind these R regulations was to permit only residential use, one concept that the drafters of the 61 resolution had to understand and to deal with was, well, we won't have office buildings and we won't have hotels and department stores. The residential neighborhood does need some level of commercial activity. They need ground floor retail uses. So the question was how to permit ground floor retail that provides the basic services to residential neighborhoods, such as grocery stores and laundromats and pet stores, children clothes stores. How could you fit those into a residential neighborhood? And so what they came up with was, if you look up and down the R7A avenues in the East Village map, you can see hatching. Each of the portion of the block fronting on the avenue within the R7A has a hatching. And the hatching is called technically the commercial overlay. And what that allows is for those buildings on those portions of the blocks fronting on an avenue can have ground floor retail. Second, third, fourth, fifth floor and up must be residential. But if you build your building within the hatched areas facing an avenue, you can have ground floor retail. So that's how they solved the problem of having ground floor retail for the residential neighborhoods in New York City without allowing large commercial developments. If you look slightly north of the East Village, above 14th Street, you see this large white block with an R72. That's Stuyvesant Town. It's a large residential neighborhood, we all know, and it only requires one designation. It's R72 only. It doesn't require multiple designations like the East Village because it's one large residential development. And you can see there's no hatching in the middle. It's because the middle of Side Town, as many of us know, is all parks and playgrounds for the residents. There's some hatching around the edges of it to allow the retail uses that that community needs, and they can go into the East Village. But within the block itself, it's R72 period, residential only. And then I want to discuss briefly why the US that I referenced and the LI referenced, because sometimes zoning, you'll see both of those are shaded. And the reason is sometimes zoning will address a specific problem or issue within a certain neighborhood. And so in the case of Union Square, back in the 80s, Union Square was very run down and not usable. So they shaded, there was a shaded zoning area created around Union Square, which had more flexible retail uses, larger retail uses. And the idea was to create street traffic and to bring people in. So the zoning loosened up a bit on the on the commercial restrictions in the Union Square. And that was to bring more street traffic in. Then the Parks Department came in and fixed the park up. Social services agencies came in and helped with the people who had issues. And so now 40 years later, you can see that that special district worked. Now, some of us may not remember the problems of Union Square 40 years ago, but I bring that to your attention because I want to show that the reason Union Square is what it is today, which is a functioning park with playgrounds and dog runs and benches that work, that are in good shape, is because of a zoning, special zoning district that was created around the Union Square back in 1980. The same thing happened in Little Italy. If you look at the Little Italy map in the lower left side, you can see the shading. Little Italy was a major tourist attraction, and more importantly, it had lots of architectural old buildings that reflected the architecture of the immigration movement. And the concern was that the Little Italy buildings would be torn down and replaced by more modern buildings as time went on. So back in 1980, the city, in an attempt to preserve Little Italy and its cultural heritage, created special zoning regulations for Little Italy in that shaded area. And basically what it does is it limits the amount of square footage, it limits the amount of height. So a designation in Little Italy that may allow a large building is capped by the Little Italy special districts. They preempt the underlying zoning. And so you can see 40 years later, while the population of Little Italy has changed to some degree, no question about that, but the Little Italy structures and buildings are still there. So it's still preserved in its architectural integrity. Now, those were two special districts dealing with a problem back 40 years ago. I want to now look at one that was more recent to give you an idea of how this works. If we move across the East River to Williamsburg in Brooklyn, if you look running north-south, are these shaded areas in Williamsburg. And it's the same concept there. 10 years ago, I mean, Williamsburg was constructed as a port neighborhood back late 1800s, early 1900s. It was zoned for manufacturing only, and manufacturing does not allow residential, and it was to serve the ports. The ports 30, 40 years ago began to disappear. The boats vanished, they moved elsewhere. And then, so now what happened in Williamsburg was you had a lot of old industrial buildings that were designed to serve the ports that were now being vacated. They were being converted illegally to residential. Meanwhile, you still had a certain amount of active manufacturing uses in Williamsburg that were not related to the ports. So you had this neighborhood that was sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. It was trending towards residential. People wanted to move there, but it was zone manufacturing. So to preserve the existing manufacturing. So the old manufactured buildings that were no longer occupied were being converted illegally to residential. And so that was not a good situation. So what the city did was they created a special district, shaded it, as you can see, about 10 years ago. And what the shading does is it says, well, manufacturing does not allow residential, and residential neighborhoods don't permit manufacturing pursuant to zoning. That makes sense. You don't want people living next door to factories. In the case of Williamsburg and the shaded area, manufacturing and residential can coexist side by side. So they had to come up with a special district because, as I said, typically manufacturing districts don't permit residential, and residential doesn't permit manufacturing. If you're in the shaded area, you can do either one. That way, the existing manufacturing is preserved and is zoned correctly. It doesn't have to be given grandfather status if they change the whole neighborhood to residential only. And at the same time, next door, the abandoned buildings could be converted legally to residential, and the vacant lots could be rebuilt with new residential. And so now if you go into Williamsburg, you see a much different situation than 10 years ago, much more active, much more lively, and the buildings are all legalized. So that is an overview of how zoning works on the city map. And now that we have a sense of these different types of neighborhoods, you have residential neighborhoods, you have manufacturing neighborhoods. Let's move on to the next phase of our analysis. The next thing we're going to look at are use groups. What is permitted on my property? So we'll start with the residential use groups. As I said, that only permits residential. And the way this chart works is, if you go down the column of use groups, you see R1, you see the R1, R2, R3, all the way down to R10 at the bottom. But if you see across the row at the top, you see these numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what does that mean? Well, you see under residential, you have 1, and under residential, you have 2. And under community facility, you have 3, and community facility, you have 4. What does that mean? Residential use group 1 is a single family home surrounded by yards. Residential use group 2 is everything else. So the residential use groups are broken down into single family homes and everything else from a two-party home to a skyscraper. And then you have, now, one thing I should mention is community facilities are allowed in all districts in New York City. And that's because the zoning wanted to encourage community facilities, schools and hospitals and churches in any neighborhood. So, and they broke it down between two different use groups. So you see use group 3 and 4, they're both community facility use groups, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So basically, if you look at this chart and you look at your residential uses, and you'll see here on my arrow up and down the residential district, you see the use groups 1, 2, 3, 4. And then what you do is you go to the chart, and as long as there's an X marked, that means you can use that use group in that residential districts. Okay, you see the residential use groups up and down this column. And you see the use groups 1, 2, 3, 4 along this row. And so let's go to an R3-1. Let's say you're in an R3-1 district and you want to do residential use group 1, there's an X. Use group 2, there's an X. Use group 3, there's also an X. And use group 4, there's an X. So you're allowed to do any residential or community facility use group. And you'll notice that all the boxes in this chart are checked, except for this one right here. There's only one that's not checked. And there's a reason for that. R1 and R2 are neighborhoods that only permit single family homes. So you see only an X in use group 1, single family homes, and R1s and R2s, you can't build a party wall house or a 2-family house or a skyscraper or an apartment building or anything else. The R1s and R2s are primarily found in Staten Island. So, well, this chart is fairly simple because all the boxes are checked except one. Let's now move on to the next chart, which is commercial use groups. So this is a commercial use group chart, and it works very much the same as a residential, but it's more complicated. You can see lots of blank boxes and lots of check boxes, but it's the same basic concept. You have over on the left, you have the various commercial zoning districts, C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you have across the top use groups. You have 1 and 2, the residential, 3 and 4, the community facility, and then a series of commercial ones, 5 through 16. So let's take a look at how this works. You can see for all the commercial use groups, you can do residential 1 and 2 in all of them, and you can do the community facility 3 and 4 in all of them. While a commercial use group is called commercial, it's really a mixed use group that allows both residential and commercial. Residential, as I said, only allows residential, but a commercial allows both residential and community facility. And then it allows a variety of different types of commercial use groups. And there it gets more complicated because you have to decide if you're going to build a commercial building, and what type you're going to build, which district you can be in. And so where you see lots of X's and on blank boxes, it's a little bit simpler than that, because use group 5 is, there's 2 main use groups. Use group 5, which is hotels, which means hotels are permitted as of right everywhere. But as you may know, there was a recent zoning change that now require all hotels to go through a special permit process. So this table is going to change, and it's going to become blank up and down here. Right now, it still stands. That regulation is just being adopted. It may be challenged in court, but for the time being, assume hotels are permitted as of right pursuant to this chart. And then use group 6 is really the biggest commercial use group. It's office buildings and retail and restaurants. So any office use, any retail use, and any restaurant use is use group 3. And so most of the time when I'm looking at a commercial district, what people are interested in is the use group 6 uses. So it's pretty much permitted everywhere. There's one where it's one area, C3. C3 is waterfront specialized, but all the major commercial use groups, you can do offices and retail and hotel. But then if you start doing use group 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you can see sometimes it's permitted, sometimes it's not permitted. So if you're going to use one of those use groups, you have to be careful which commercial district you're in. But let's take a little closer look at those use groups so you can understand a little bit better what's going on here. As I said, use group 5 is hotels. Use group 6, offices, retail, restaurants. Use group 7 is funeral homes, exterminators, taxidermists, tire sales. These are related because they all have toxic uses. They have chemicals, so they're more prohibited. They're only allowed in certain commercial districts. Use group 8 is bowling alleys, pool halls, theaters, driving schools. These tend to be large public areas. Again, that's where they're lumped together as use group 8. They're permitted in most, but not all commercial districts. Use group 9 is large showrooms, auto and boat rooms, which you'll see 11th Avenue in Manhattan up and down in 11th Avenue in the 50s. You'll see all those auto showrooms. You go to waterfront districts, you'll see boat showrooms. And then you have gyms, which gyms, I mean, not health clubs, but tennis courts, basketball courts. And then use group 10 is large department stores like Macy's, carpet, clothing, and fabric. So you get into specialized use groups, you've got to make sure you can fit into the commercial district you're in. Now let's talk about the last use group, community facility use groups. As I said, it's permitted in all zoning districts. But what's the most interesting thing about community facility use groups is that while it typically includes, as the second bullet says, schools and colleges and dorms and churches, if you look at the third bullet, it includes doctor's offices. Now, the difference between a doctor's office and all those other uses is that a doctor's office is for profit, and many of those other uses are not for profit. And as you'd expect, community facility use could be not for profit, but they included doctor's offices in there. So you might ask yourself, well, why are there doctor's offices in community facility use groups? And the reason is that they wanted doctor's offices and hospitals to be permitted to be built in residential districts. They wanted to make sure that if they put doctor's offices and hospitals in the commercial use group, then you couldn't build them in residential districts. So they put them in the community facility use group, which means that you can build them in residential neighborhoods so people have easy access to their doctors. And so if you walk down a Park Slope neighborhood of brownstones and you see a doctor's office in the stoop apartment, now you understand why that's permitted. If you walk along Central Park West on all those large buildings, which are in residential only districts, the ground floor tends to be either lobbies or doctor's offices. You'll see one doctor's office after another, and that's why they're there. And it's very useful for those large residential buildings because sometimes people don't want to live on the ground floor, so they use the ground floor for lobbies and for the doctor's offices. So if you're a manager of a property and you have a large residential property, you have a ground floor, you're wondering how to fill the space, and you can't do retail, remember you can always put doctor's offices down there, as you can see throughout the city of New York. So now we've got our use groups, our commercial use groups, our residential use groups, our community facility use groups, and which ones can go in which districts. So the next important consideration is bulk. How many square feet can I build in my property? And this is based on what's called a floor area ratio, or FAR. Every piece of property has an FAR assigned to it. We'll look at some of the tables shortly. And it's a simple mathematical equation. You take the total square footage of your site, you multiply by the FAR number, and that's your total square footage. It's a simple calculation, but perhaps one of the most important in zoning. For instance, let's say you have a 10,000 square foot site. You have a 2 FAR, you can build 20,000 square feet. You have a 3 FAR, you can build 30,000 square feet. Now, in the example down below, it's a simple example just to give you a sense of how it works. We're going to assume it's a 10 in these 3 buildings you see at the bottom here. Assume your lot is 10,000 square feet and your FAR is 1. So you can build 1 times 10,000, which equals 10,000. So on the example on the left, the person has decided to build a 1-story building. So they build a 1-story, 10,000 square foot building that covers the whole lot. In the middle example, person wants to build 2 floors. So you build 2 5,000 square foot floors. 2 times 5,000 equals 10,000. So you cover half the lot with 2 buildings. That's your 10,000 square feet. The other half of the lot is open space, maybe parking, maybe a park. Depends what you want to use it for. And the third example, the far right, the person says, I want to build 4 floors. So they build 4 floors, each is 2,500 square feet. 4 times 2,500 is 10,000. So again, you have your 10,000 square foot of total building area, but you only cover 25% of the lot, and the other 75% of the lot can be even more open space. So here's an example where the FAR is the same for 3 pieces of property, but it can be distributed differently depending on how many floors you want to build. So now the next question is the residential FAR. How do you determine the FAR for your particular piece of property? And so there's a series of charts for residential, commercial, that tell you how to do this. And so here's an example of several residential districts, 6 down to R10. And then, so you find your district, let's say you're in R6, and you go to the far right and you find your FAR number, in this case, 2.2. And so in my case of 10,000 square feet, you take 10,000 square feet, multiply by 2.2, you get 22,000 square feet. And so, and let's say you're in an R6B, you have 2 FAR, so 2 times 10,000 equals 20,000 square feet. Now I want to look at this blue arrow because we're going to use one example to go through how different FARs relate to each other in different types of use groups. This will make sense. So let's look at the blue arrow, and the blue arrow says R9, and you go over to the right side, and the blue arrow there says the FAR is 7.52. Let's make it 7.5 just to make life easier. So if you're in an R9 district and your square footage is 10,000 square feet, your lot square footage, you have 7.5 times 10,000. You can build 75,000 square feet. So there's an example, and we're going to use this R9 example as I go through these next couple of charts. So bear in mind, R9 is FAR, residential FAR 7.5. So now we're going to look at the FAR in commercial districts. And as I said before, while a residential district only allows residential uses, a commercial district is a mixed use district and allows residential and commercial and community facility. So it has more complexities than a residential district. And in a commercial district, you have to look up, there's different FAR for the different uses. There's an FAR for residential, FAR for commercial use, and there's an FAR for community facility use. And you have to look up the FAR at all 3 types of uses to do a calculation of a commercial building in a commercial district. So we'll start with this first chart. And as it says here, this is the commercial FAR in a commercial district. So we're first going to decide how much commercial space can I build in my building, just commercial. And let's start with an example. Look at the blue arrow. And over the left of the districts, you see C16, C17. Let's look at C18. C18 is going to be the sample I use here to show how this works. So you're in a C18 district and you want to know what your commercial FAR is. On the right, it's 2.0. So 10,000 square feet times 2 is 20,000 square feet. So in a C18 commercial district, I can build a 20,000 square foot commercial building only. Okay, but now let's move on to the residential FAR in a commercial district. How do you calculate that? So here's a chart. You see districts on the left, FARs. Well, you don't see FARs on the right here. What you see on the right here is something different. On the left, you have, let's look at the blue arrow. You see here the C18. We're in a commercial district. C18, as I said before, we know the commercial FAR is 2. What's the residential FAR? You move over to the right on the blue arrow. It's every commercial district is assigned a residential district equivalent. In this case, for a C18, it's R9. So we know now in a C18, the commercial FAR is 2.0 per the chart before. And we go to this chart, we see the C18, we go over to the right side, we see it's an R9 assigned district. And as we know from before, an R9 allows 7.5 FAR. So now what you have is, you now know the commercial FAR, you now know the residential FAR. Now, how does this all come together? Let's be clear in this next example here. So now you're in a mixed use. What's the mixed use FAR in a commercial district? Remember, we're in a C18 and the residential equivalent is R9. How does this all work? It's actually relatively straightforward. The commercial FAR in C18 is 2.0. We know that. The residential FAR is the R9 equivalent, which is 7.5. We looked at that before. And then if you go to the community facility FAR chart, which I did, the community facility FAR in the C18 is 10.0. So here we have in a sample of a commercial district, a C18, getting 3 different FAR numbers. So what is it that you can build? You don't add these numbers together to get 19.5. This note is important. If you're building a mixed-use building in a commercial district, the total building size is determined by the largest FAR number of the various permitted uses. In this case, 10. So we have a 10,000 square foot lot times 10 is 100,000 square feet. So your total building size is 100,000 square feet, but within that 100,000 square feet, you can fit your other uses, your commercial and residential uses pursuant to the FAR number. So let me give an example, which hopefully explains this a little more clearly. Here's an example, 10,000 square foot lot. The commercial FAR is 2, so you can build 20,000 square feet of commercial. Residential FAR is 7.5. You can build 75,000 square feet of residential. So what have you got left over? 0.5. So the community facility FAR, you use only 0.5. You build 5,000 square feet of community facility, and look what you have. Your FAR equals 10, and your building size equals 100,000 square feet. Hope that's clear. So in a mixed-use district, you get the 3 different FAR numbers. You pick the highest one, that's your total building size, and you fit the other ones within that building size to come up with a mixed-use building. So now that we know our use groups, and now that we know our floor area and total building size, let's look at another important consideration, which is the height of the building, as I mentioned before. So how do you determine the height of the building? Well, there's a lot of different charts. Here's one we're going to look at. It's residential. We're going to look at residential districts and what is the height of the building. And on the left is the residential district. And on the very far right is the maximum building height. So if you're in an R6A, you can build a 70-foot, the building can be 70 feet high. If you're in an R7D, you can build 100 feet high. Now, remember when we looked at the East Village, the avenues were R7A. So R7A, you can build 80-foot high building. And the mid blocks were R8B. R8B is 75. So it's not a dramatic difference, but you can see that the mid block is 75 feet and the avenues was 80 feet. It's only, the East Village is not as dramatic. If you go to the Upper East Side, if you go to the Upper East Side, the brownstones neighbors in the mid-block will often be R8B and kept at 75 feet. But many times the avenues on the Upper East Side, 1st, 2nd, 3rd Avenue, are more in the R9 range, R9A, and you can build 135 feet. So it's more dramatic because up in the Upper East Side, the avenues are wider and they were built more recently, but it's the same concept between the narrow street and the wide streets. So this is a simple way of how you determine the residential the residential height in a district. So now that we've looked at sort of the height of the building, I want to just talk about two other important building size factors. One is density. Density limits the amount of units you can build. If you're building a residential building, you can't just pack in as many units as you want. You can't just fill it up with small studios. They limit it. They want to make sure you don't condense it the apartments are not too condensed. So there's a density factor with every residential district. In this case, let's look at my example here. You'll see the 75,000 square, the R9. Let's use that sample of 75,000 square foot. The density factor is 680. And so you take the 75,000, divide by 680, and it equals 110. So that means in that sample we were talking about with the R9, we could build a 75,000 square foot building. You can't build more than 110 units. I've never known anybody to hit that limit. It's usually they end up smaller, but you can't pack in 200, 300 units into the building. So that's a very important calculation. And then another one is lot coverage. The next bullet, you see lot coverage. And that, calculates the amount of, zoning doesn't want you to cover the entire lot in most cases. So what zoning says, every zoning district, but residential, has a lot coverage number. In this case, for the R9, it's 70%. And so that means you can only cover 70% of your lot. So in the case of a 10,000 square foot, you can only cover 70% with the building footprint, or in this case, 7,000 square feet, and the remaining 3,000 has to be open space. And what this basically, the lot coverage tells you is what's the size of your building footprint. So in this case, you're building an R9 building on a 10,000 square foot lot, your footprint's going to be 7,000 square feet. You can't go bigger than that per floor, and the rest of the space will be open. And then we talked about height. We already talked about that. In the case of the R9, 145 feet. So these are all very important considerations: your maximum number of units, your maximum building footprint, and your maximum height. And so now let's go and do a simple analysis of two properties, one in a residential district and one in a mixed-use district, to see how this all comes together. So in example one, you have a 20,000 square foot lot. We're going to make it a little bit bigger, 20,000. You're in an R6A. So what is the FAR? It's 3. So 3 times 20,000 equals 60,000 square feet. So your building has a maximum square footage of 60,000. What is the maximum height? 70 feet, pursuant to the charts. What's the maximum lot coverage? In the R6A, it's 65%. So that means your footprint is 65% of 20,000 square feet, or 13,000 square feet. And what is the maximum density? The factor, again, is 680. You take the 60,000 square foot of total building area, divided by 680, you get 88 units. So there we have 60,000 square foot building, maximum height of 70 feet, maximum floor plate of 13,000, and total units 88. In example 2, to 20,000 square foot, it's in a commercial district, a C6-2A. We're going to just look at a residential development in a C, even though it's a mixed, it's a commercial district, you can do commercial and residential. We're going to just do a residential building in a C6-2A. So you find the equivalent district, which in the first line is R8A. What's the FAR for R8A? It's 6.0. You take 6.0 times 20,000, you get 120,000 square feet. That's the maximum floor area. What's the maximum height? You go to the chart, it's 120 feet. And then you take what's the maximum lot coverage? It happens to be in a C6-2A, 70%. So your footprint is 14,000 square feet, which is 70% of the 20,000 square feet. And what's your maximum density? The factor is 680. So you take your 120,000 square feet, divide by 680, you get 176 units. So I hope that makes sense. I wanted to show sort of an example of two quick zoning analysis, down and dirty, that I do based on the charts and tables we went through. And now I want to go on to the air rights transfers. How does that work? How do properties transfer development rights between two different properties? And so it's going to be based on this sample here. I show you an example here. At the top, you see tax lot A and tax lot B, which are each their own zoning lot. Tax lot A is its own zoning lot A, and tax lot B is its own zoning lot B. And the way the city of New York works is each tax lot is its own zoning lot. That's how it starts. And so you can build, whatever you build on tax lot A is based on the zoning regulations for tax lot A, which is the zoning lot A. And same with B. But if you want to transfer development rights between tax lot A and tax lot B, you have to do, you look at the bottom row and the bottom box, you have to combine tax lot A and tax lot B into a single zoning lot, lot A and B. So you take tax lot A, tax lot B, and you execute a document that makes them a single zoning lot. Now, what's important is that the tax lot parameters remain unchanged. Tax lot A is still its own tax lot, has its own meets and bounds, it has its own ownership perhaps. It can have two different owners. It has its own assessment, it has its own water bills, it has its own liability, its own insurance. So when you combine two tax lots into a single zoning lot, the tax lot ownership qualities remain unchanged. And that's very important because if tax lot A is a small owner and tax lot B is a large developer, and tax lot A wants to sell some development rights to a large developer, and it's going to have to be combined into a single zoning lot to do this, the small owner doesn't want the larger developer telling them what to do with their property. So it's, so what is clear is that the small owner will still maintain full ownership, meets and bounds, their own assessment. Their assessment won't go up because they're next to a large development. They can sell their property, no problem. They can mortgage their property, refinance their property. So because of that, and because there's certainty that that will happen when you do the merger, small owners are willing to sell to larger developers without having to worry that the property will be controlled in any way by the larger building. But let's just look at some examples of why people combine tax lots into a single zoning lot. So let's say in this example here, lot A can build a 4-story building and tax lot B can build a 4-story building. So now let's just say perchance that tax lot A is owned by a school, a 1-story building. So they have 3 floors they're never going to use. They got their 1-story school, they're never going to use it. So what they do, so they take tax lot A and tax lot B, they combine them below into a single zoning lot. Now tax lot A can take those 3 unused floors and transfer them to tax lot B. Tax lot B already has 4 floors. They now have the 3 floors in tax lot A. They can now build a 7-story building. So at the end of the day, when you do this, when you merge them into a single zoning lot and transfer, tax lot A has their 1-floor school, which is what they're happy to have, and tax lot B now has 7 floors, and tax lot A can sell those 3 floors over to tax lot B and have that money to run their school. That's a very typical. Sometimes tax lot A is a church. It could be 1 story. It's never going bigger. So it's a prime candidate to sell to the neighbor next door. Sometimes tax lot A and tax lot B have the same controlling entity. They may have different LLC names, but they have the same controlling entity. And so the owner controls both. And they say, you know what, I'm going to combine tax lot A into tax lot B, make them one single zoning lot. I'm going to take all 4 floors off A, put them on lot B, build an 8-story on lot B, which is more valuable because it has higher floors. And I'll use tax lot A as a vacant land for some amenity for the residents of the building, playground, parking, park. And that happens too. So sometimes you have one owner who controls both properties. And by combining those 2 lots into a single zoning lot, they can move the floor area around between the 2 of them in a way that creates more value. And I just also want to point out that there's no limit on the number of tax lots in a zoning lot. Some tax lots, some zoning lots have 6 or 7 tax lots in them. One prime example is, let's say you have a row of almost all brownstones are underbuilt. So sometimes a big corner property on the Upper East Side, they have a large developer has a large piece of property. They'll combine their large property at the corner with maybe 7 brownstones running down the street, transfer all the unused development rights from those 7 brownstones onto their larger development and build a bigger building. Maybe they go from 40 stories to 60 stories, perhaps. And that in their case, the zoning lot consists of the large corner lot and 7 brownstone lots. There's no limit. There's no limit to the number of tax lots that can be combined into a single zoning lot. And as I said, in all cases, the tax lot owner maintains their own ownership rights. It's very important for that to be in place. All of these concepts are captured in what's called the zoning lot development agreement. This is a ZELDA. Many of you may have heard of a ZELDA, ZLDA. And let's just go down. These bullets kind of lay out the basic principles of how a ZELDA works. First, the seller retains the ownership of any development rights used by seller's existing building. So I talked about that. Church, school, the one-story owner maintains full ownership of what they're going to keep after the transfer. In some cases, the seller gives the buyer a light and air easement of the property, because in my example there of the school, it's a one-story building. The developer buys 3 floors, builds an 8-story building next door. They want to maybe have nice views over the school towards a park or a river. So the seller will grant a light and air easement over their property, so the seller of the larger building can have large living room windows and bedroom windows facing over the seller's property, and they know it's preserved forever by giving a light and air easement. The seller can never tear down their 1-story building and build a small 4-story building. They can never go higher than their 1 store. So and that adds to the price. You pay for when you buy development rights, you pay for them. And you buy a light and air easement, you pay a little extra. And then the seller grants the buyer an approval to add additional tax lots, because that's important, because maybe the developer is going to add 5 or 6 tax lots into the zoning lot. So once the first lot is purchased, the air rights are purchased of the first lot signs off on any other additional lots added later. You don't want once the developer buys the development rights from lot 1 and they want to add lots 2, 3, and 4, you don't want the lot 1 guy to keep saying, pay me again and again and again. They've automatically signed off on creating a larger zoning lot, adding more tax lots. So, and then here's something very important. The seller's lender subordinates to the ZELDA. So the developer doesn't want, the bank of a brownstone 20 years later to say, I'm foreclosing on the brownstone, and those development rights you purchased, they're mine. I'm going to foreclose on you as well, or you're going to pay me. So basically, the lender on the seller's property signs a waiver saying, I sign off on the ZELDA, I sign off on the transfer. I have no rights to those unused development rights, and that's not a problem because the lender's collateral is the building. In my case, it's the brownstone. They don't have the collateral is not the unused air rights that might be used someday. So I never have a problem getting the lender to sign the waiver saying we subordinate and waive our rights to the sale of the unused development rights. They maintain their collateral in the building itself. And then lastly, the ZELDA is recorded against all the tax lots. So that way, in my sample, let's say the owner of the brownstone sells their property 30 years later, the new buyer comes in and says, hey, I've got unused development rights. I want to build my building bigger. They can't because they're on notice, because the ZELDA and all these documents that are attached to it are recorded. So the buyer of that brownstone is on notice that, it's assuming they've done a title report, and they'll say, hey, wait, this is ZELDA here from 30 years ago, and I don't have those excess development rights. I'm just buying the building itself. So that completes the presentation. Thank you for joining me. I hope you find the information useful. If you have any questions, you can reach me at the Lasser Law Group website. All my contact information is there. My name is Chris Wright. And I would appreciate it if you would click like and subscribe at the end here to show your support. And I hope to hear from you, and thank you for your time.